So the story starts with a young man named David Bankston. He is 20 years old and goes to Trent Blue University. He is seated at his desk taking a math test. He stares at one of the questions very closely. He attempts to write an answer down but can't bring himself to do it because he knows it's wrong. Suddenly, his professor, Mrs. Shirley, yells out to the class that time is up, and all of the tests should be brought up to her desk. David is nervous and scared to even stand up, but he works up the courage and heads over to her desk. He hands in his test and exits the classroom. He walks down the hall depressed, knowing that he failed his test. After he exits, he heads into a small dark alley near the school. Two men can be seen leaning against a wall. One of them has a hoodie and the other looks like a nerd as David heads down the alley. He fist bumps both of them, and one of the men hands David a roll of weed. This man's name is Chris. The other man is named Jesse. All three of them are the same age. As David takes out his lighter from his pocket, Jesse glances over at Chris as if he has an idea. David smokes his weed and leans against the wall, right before Chris asks David if he's interested in trying something new. David respectfully declines as if he assumes that Chris is asking him to do something very dangerous and maybe illegal. But it's quite the opposite. Chris tells Jesse to show David what he's talking about. Jesse takes a small pill out of his pocket and shows David. David shakes his head and repeatedly tells Chris that he's not interested. But then Chris tells David that he won't regret listening to what it is. Finally, David gives in and pays attention. Chris tells Jesse to tell him about it. Jesse tells David that whatever he thinks it might be, it's not. It's a new drug that Jesse's been developing for months. He tells David that its purpose isn't bad at all. It's not going to get him high or get him arrested. Jesse then says that he calls it the plagiarism pill. It's a pill that will allow his brain to acquire knowledge within seconds of either listening to it or seeing it. Jesse hands the pill over to David. He lets it rest in his hand as he stares at it. Chris walks over to David and tells him that he's going to give him $500 in case he's nervous about taking the pill. David doesn't think much of it, accepts the $500 and the pill. Before he leaves, Jesse tells David to let him know about any results with faster brain function, easier time figuring out problems, and any other changes he notices. David agrees and exits. Cut to the next day. David gets dressed in his dorm room. He spots the pill on his dresser. He contemplates for a second before ultimately grabbing the pill and swallowing it with water. 2 hours later, he sits at his desk in a classroom, about to take a biology test. The professor warns the whole class that the test will be worth 20% of their grade. Suddenly, as David remains seated paying attention to the professor, his eyes widen, his head moves back like he's experiencing something weird. The professor hands out the test papers to each and every student, then ultimately to David. David grabs the paper and rests it on his desk. He takes one look at one of the questions, grabs his pencil, and answers the question instantaneously. Within 20 seconds, David completes all 20 questions. He stands up out of his seat and hands the professor his paper. The professor is completely confused and curious as to how David finished within 20 seconds. The professor asks David to clarify if he actually finished within 20 seconds while looking over at his desk to see if anything is there that could have helped him cheat, but nothing. As he takes the paper and looks over the test, his eyes widen in shock. He then tells David to take his seat as he walks over to his computer. David smiles as he stands next to his desk. We now enter a montage sequence of David taking all of his tests and finishing his homework within seconds, his hand not being able to stop writing and answering. Then, we cut to David walking down the same dark alley as before. David sees Chris, but Jesse is nowhere to be seen. David then asks where Jesse is. Chris replies that he was arrested for drug dealing right after they left the alley. David is in shock and a little nervous. He asks Chris if he knows when the pill will wear off and what'll happen. Chris tells him that he doesn't know. Chris asks David if the pill is even working, and David tells him that it's working perfectly. He's finishing tests and homework assignments within seconds like it was for preschool students. Then, David freezes like he just figured something out. All David says after is that he has an idea. Cut to David's dorm room. David enters and runs to his laptop. He opens it up and clicks on Google search. He types in the search bar, the hardest math question in the world. As he clicks enter, a very confusing and difficult-looking question pops up. David smiles and gets excited. He takes out a piece of paper and begins answering the question. As he starts to write numbers, he stops, as if he's confused. He focuses on the problem on the screen, but still squints like he doesn't understand. Then he begins to speak, but not words. He slurs his words very awkwardly like he is learning a language for the very first time. His eyes widen in fear. He panics by running around his dorm room. He holds his face. He freezes for a second before he races to his pencil and paper. He begins to write, but then he just scribbles. It's like he completely forgot how to write. Suddenly, David begins to hyperventilate. He races around his room, panicking and screaming until... We're in a small classroom now. There's only 8 students, including David. The other 7 students are either Down syndrome, autistic, or very, very slow learners in certain subjects. The teacher just finished writing a sentence on the board. She turns around and asks out loud, who would want to read the sentence to the whole class? Nobody raises their hand at first until David slowly raises his hand. The teacher smiles and congratulates David for even participating. He stands up and attempts to read the sentence out loud. He squints and says, I swam in te. The teacher cuts David off and says, it's pronounced to, not te. David then apologizes and attempts again. David says, I swam into the lake. The teacher congratulates David and everyone in the class applauds him. He smiles as he looks around the class.